Have you ever noticed that hearing and listening are not always the same thing? You can hear someone talking without really paying attention to what they are saying. You can hear the words, but never let them sink in. Most of us have probably done that at one point or another. If we're honest, most of us have probably done that more than once. My son Tristan has given me plenty of opportunities to think about that over the years. One thing you should know about Tristan is that he can fall asleep just about anywhere. In the car, watching a movie, studying, even on the dog's bed in my office. As you can see from these pictures, that is no exaggeration. It seems like almost every night there comes a point where I tell him, "You should probably be getting to bed." And almost every night I get the same response. Not yes, not no, just eh. Then he stays up later than he should. Eventually, I find him asleep somewhere, maybe twisted into a position that doesn't even look physically possible. I tell him, "Why don't you go lie down in your bed? You'll probably get better rest that way." And once again, I get that same response. Then he falls right back asleep. The next day, he'll complain that his neck hurts or his back is sore, and I have to resist the urge to say, there was a solution to that. The funny thing is that even though he doesn't always listen to my advice about getting enough sleep, he eventually gets the sleep one way or another. It may not be the ideal way. It may not be the comfortable way. It may not be the way I suggested. But sooner or later, sleep catches up with him. The older I get, the more I realize that all of us are a little like that. We hear things without listening. Sometimes it doesn't matter all that much. Sometimes it means waking up with a sore neck because you fell asleep in a recliner. But sometimes the stakes are much higher. Sometimes relationships suffer because people stop listening to one another. Sometimes families carry wounds for years because people talk past one another instead of hearing one another. Sometimes people feel invisible because no one seems willing to listen to their pain. And sometimes the deepest hurt comes not from being disagreed with, but from feeling unheard. Our scripture this morning is a story about listening, or perhaps more accurately, a story about people who are struggling to listen. Sarah sees a threat where she should see a family member. Hagar finds herself pushed aside and forgotten. Abraham is caught in the middle, torn between people he loves. Everyone is hurting. Everyone is afraid. Everyone is trying to protect something. And in the middle of all of that pain and confusion, people stop hearing one another. Yet this story is not ultimately about human failure. It is about divine faithfulness. Because while the people in this story struggle to hear one another, there is one voice that does hear. When Hagar finds herself alone in the wilderness, when Ishmael's future seems uncertain, when all hope appears to be running out as quickly as the water in their water skins, God hears. In fact, one of the most important truths in this entire passage is that God hears the voices that others overlook. And if we're going to become people God is forming us to be, then we will need to learn to hear as God hears. One of the things I appreciate about the Bible is that it rarely cleans up the stories. If human beings were writing propaganda about the heroes of faith, we would probably leave out a lot of the uncomfortable details. We would polish the rough edges. We would make everyone look a little wiser, a little kinder, a little more faithful than they really were. The Bible does not do that. Instead, it gives us stories like this one. Over the past 2 weeks, we have been following Abraham and Sarah as God begins forming a family, through whom all the families of the earth will be blessed. A few weeks ago, God called Abraham to leave everything familiar behind and journey towards a future that only God could see. God promised descendants. God promised land. God promised blessing. But most importantly, God promised to be present with Abraham every step of the way. Last week, we celebrated the fulfillment of one of those promises. After years of waiting, after years of disappointment, after years of wondering whether God's promises would ever come true, Isaac was born. The child of promise had finally arrived, and Sarah laughed. Not the laughter of doubt that we talked about last week, but the laughter of joy. The laughter of someone who has discovered that God really does keep God's promises. At the end of that story, everything seems hopeful. Everything seems full of possibility. Everything seems to be moving exactly as it should. But then we come to today's reading, directly following last week's, and almost immediately the celebration gives way to conflict. That is often how life works. One moment everything feels settled. The next moment an old wound reopens. One prayer is answered and suddenly another challenge emerges. One problem is solved and another takes its place. The birth of Isaac fulfilled God's promise, but it did not magically solve every problem in Abraham's family. In some ways, it created new tensions. Ishmael is no longer a child. He is a teenager now. Abraham loves him. He is Abraham's son too. Sarah sees him interacting with Isaac and becomes concerned. Perhaps she fears for Isaac's future. Perhaps she worries about inheritance. Perhaps old resentments that never fully healed begin to resurface again. Whatever her motives, she demands that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. It is a painful moment. And what makes the story difficult is that there are no easy villains. Sarah is not entirely wrong. God has already said that the covenant promise will continue through Isaac, yet Sarah's solution feels harsh. Abraham is heartbroken. The text tells us that he's distressed because of his son. He loves Ishmael. He does not want to send him away. Yet Abraham also finds himself caught between competing responsibilities and competing loves. And then there's Hagar. It is easy to overlook her because the story often focuses on Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. But imagine what this moment feels like from her perspective. Years earlier, she had been brought into the situation not by her own choosing. She'd become a pawn in someone else's attempt to fulfill God's promise. She had already experienced rejection once before. Now she finds herself pushed aside yet again. The celebration of one child becomes the exile of another one. Nobody in the story walks away untouched. Nobody in the story gets everything that they want. Nobody seems entirely at peace. Which is one reason that I find this story so believable, because this is what real families look like. Not perfect, not simple, not free from conflict. Families carry misunderstandings. Families carry old wounds. Families carry fears and disappointments and complicated histories. Sometimes even the people who love one another deeply end up hurting one another. Genesis does not pretend otherwise. What is remarkable is that God does not abandon this family because of their imperfections. God does not wait for everyone to get their act together before remaining involved in their lives. God continues working through people who are frightened, flawed, and struggling. That is good news for Abraham's family. And if we are honest, it is good news for our families too. Because if God only worked through perfect people, there would be no story to tell. What we discover throughout Genesis is that God keeps showing up in the middle of imperfect situations. God keeps working through imperfect people. God keeps moving the story forward even when the people involved cannot see how things could possibly work out. And that becomes especially important as the story moves from the family home into the wilderness. The story shifts from the tension of Abraham's household to the harsh reality of the wilderness. Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away with bread and water. It's not much for a journey into the wilderness, but it's what they have. The text tells us that Hagar wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. That word wandered is important. This is not a leisurely walk. This is not a family outing. This is the picture of someone who has lost her direction, someone who does not know where to go next, someone who is trying to survive one step at a time. Eventually, the water runs out. The little bit of security they had is gone. The little bit of hope that they were carrying begins to disappear, and Hagar reaches her breaking point. She places Ishmael under a bush and walks away. Not because she does not love him, not because she has given up on him, but because she cannot bear to watch him die. It is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in all of Genesis. A mother sits down at a distance and begins to weep. A son cries out in the wilderness. There is no indication that anyone else hears them. Abraham is gone. Sarah is gone. There's no community around them. No one is coming to help. No one is rushing over the horizon with supplies. No one seems to even know that they are there. Have you ever felt like that? Perhaps not literally in a wilderness, but maybe in one of life's wilderness seasons. A season when you felt forgotten. A season when you felt isolated. A season when it seemed like everyone else had moved on while you were left trying to figure out what came next. A season when your prayers felt like they disappeared into the air. Many of us know what that feels like, which is why what happens next is so important. The text says, God heard the voice of the boy. Not God noticed, not God eventually discovered, not God happened to come by. God heard. The name Ishmael literally means God hears. And in this moment, that meaning becomes reality. God hears the cry from the wilderness. God hears the voice that everyone else has lost track of. God hears the child who's no longer at the center of the story. God hears the family that has been pushed to the margins. And notice something important. Nothing has changed yet. The water has not been revealed. The circumstances have not improved. The wilderness has not disappeared. The miracle begins before any of those things happen. The miracle begins when God hears. Many of us assume that God's presence can only be measured by changed circumstances. We assume that if God is with us, then the problem should immediately disappear. The diagnosis should be reversed. The conflict should be resolved. The grief should go away. The wilderness should end. Yet that is not how the story unfolds. The first sign of God's presence is not a solution. It is attention. God hears. God speaks. God reassures. God reminds Hagar and that she and her son have not been forgotten. In many ways, that may be one of the deepest human needs that we have. To know that we are seen. To know that we are heard. To know that our lives matter. To know that our pain is not invisible. One of the remarkable things about this story is that Hagar and Ishmael are not the people through whom the covenant promise will continue. The story of Israel will move on through Isaac. The promise narrows through Isaac. But God's compassion does not narrow. God's love does not narrow. God's attention does not narrow. God still hears Ishmael. God still sees Hagar. God still acts on their behalf. I think that is one of the reasons this story has spoken to so many people throughout history. It reminds us that God's concern is bigger than we often imagine. God's mercy reaches farther than we might expect. God is not only present in the lives of people we think are important. God is not only attentive to the people at the center of the story. God is also present with those who are overlooked, the forgotten, the excluded, the ones who feel like they have been left behind. And then comes one of the most beautiful lines in the passage. God opens Hagar's eyes. Notice that the text does not say God creates a well. It says God opens her eyes. The water was already there. The provision was already there. The hope was already there. What changed was her ability to see it. And perhaps that is true more often than we realize. Sometimes God's work in our lives is not creating something entirely new. Sometimes God's work is opening our eyes to the signs of grace that have been present all along. A friend who stayed beside us, a community that carried us, a strength we did not know we possessed, a hope that we thought was gone. God opens Hagar's eyes. She sees the well, the boy lives, and the story that seemed headed towards tragedy suddenly turns towards hope. Now, the story could have ended at the well. That would have been a satisfying ending. God hears, water is found, everyone survives, the end. But Genesis goes a step further. The story concludes by telling us that God was with the boy as he grew up. In other words, God was not simply present in the crisis. God remained present afterward. Sometimes we treat God's presence as though it only appears in dramatic moments. We look for the miracle. We look for the breakthrough. We look for the answer. And when those things come, we celebrate them, as we should. But the greater promise of Scripture is not simply that God occasionally intervenes. The greater promise is that God remains with us. The wilderness is not the end of Ishmael's story. In many ways, it becomes the place where he discovered that God had not abandoned him. I suspect many of us could tell similar stories. When we look back over our lives, we can often identify seasons that we never would have chosen for ourselves. Seasons of grief, seasons of uncertainty, seasons when plans fell apart, seasons when relationships changed, seasons when we found ourselves asking questions we never expected to ask. At those times, we would have done just about anything to avoid those circumstances. Yet when we look back, we sometimes discover that those difficult seasons become places where we encounter God's presence in ways we had not before. Not because suffering is good, not because hardship is something that we should seek out, but because God is able to meet us even there. Sometimes the wilderness becomes the place where we learn that God is near. Sometimes it becomes the place where our eyes are opened. Sometimes it becomes the place where we discover that God's faithfulness is larger than our circumstances. That does not mean every question gets answered. It does not mean that every wound immediately heals. It does not mean that every situation works out exactly as we had hoped. Hagar and Ishmael still had a difficult journey ahead of them. But now they knew something they did not know before. God had heard them. God had seen them. God was with them. And that made all the difference. And if that were the only message in this passage, it would already be good news. God hears us. God sees us. God is present with us. But I think this story also asks something of us. Throughout this series, we have been talking about God forming a family and preparing a people. God is not simply shaping individuals. God is shaping a community, a people whose lives reflect God's character, a people who participate in God's work in the world. And if we worship a God who hears the cries of those who have been overlooked, then surely part of our calling is to learn to hear those voices as well. One of the striking things about this story is how easy it would have been to focus only on Isaac. After all, Isaac is the child of promise. Isaac is the one through whom the covenant will continue. Isaac is the one around whom the larger story revolves. Yet Genesis refuses to let us forget about Hagar and Ishmael. The story pauses, the camera shifts, and we are invited to see the situation from their perspective. That is something that the people of God are called to do again and again. To notice the people that others overlook, to hear the voices that others ignore, to pay attention to the ones who feel forgotten. Sometimes that means listening to someone who's carrying grief. Sometimes it means making space for someone who feels alone. Sometimes it means hearing the concerns of a person whose experience is different from our own. Sometimes it means slowing down long enough to recognize that pain that would otherwise remain hidden. Listening is one of the simplest acts of love that we can offer another person, and it is becoming increasingly rare. We live in a world where everyone seems eager to speak. Everyone seems eager to give an opinion. Everyone seems eager to formulate a response before the other person has even finished speaking. Yet genuine listening is different. Listening requires humility. Listening requires patience. Listening requires setting aside, at least for a moment, our own desire to be heard so that we can truly hear someone else. And the church should be one of the places where that kind of listening still happens. Not because we always agree, not because we always have all the answers, but because we follow a God who listens. A God who hears cries from the wilderness. A God who notices people standing at the edge of the story. A God who refuses to forget those who others have forgotten. And because we have been heard by that God, we can become people who hear one another. As I was thinking about this passage this week, I kept coming back to those pictures of Tristan asleep, in the car, watching a movie, studying, curled up on the dog's bed in my office. And I kept thinking about the conversations that we had over and over again. You should probably get some sleep. You should probably go lie down. Eh. The truth is, hearing and listening are not always the same thing. Sometimes we hear words without really paying attention. Sometimes we hear what is being said but fail to recognize its importance. Sometimes we become so focused on our own concerns that we stop listening to the people around us. That is part of what is happening in Genesis 21. People are talking, people are reacting, people are hurting, but very few people are truly hearing one another. Sarah is focused on protecting Isaac. Abraham is torn between his sons. Hagar is overwhelmed by fear and grief. Everyone is carrying their own pain. And in the midst of it all, a mother and a child find themselves alone in the wilderness. Yet the good news of the story is that even when human beings fail to hear one another, God still hears. God hears the cry of Ishmael. God hears the grief of Hagar. God hears the voices that others have overlooked. God hears the people who have been pushed to the margins. God hears those who feel forgotten. And because God hears, hope remains. Not because every problem has instantly disappeared, not because every wound is immediately healed, not because life suddenly becomes easy. Hope remains because God's presence remains. The same God who met Hagar in the wilderness is still meeting people in the wilderness today. The same God who opened her eyes is still opening eyes today. The same God who hears her cry is hearing cries today. And perhaps that is the invitation of this story that's placed before us. To trust that God hears us when we find ourselves in wilderness seasons. To trust that God has not forgotten us when the path forward is unclear. And to become the kind of people who hear as God hears. People who pay attention. People who listen. People who notice those who are struggling. People who make room for voices that might otherwise be ignored. People who reflect the compassion of the God that we worship. Over the past few weeks, we have watched God form a family called to be a blessing, a family that learned to laugh again because God's promises are true. And today we discover that this family is also called to listen to God, to listen to one another, to listen for the voices that others may miss. Because the family God is forming is meant to reflect the heart of God. And the heart of God is revealed in this simple but powerful truth. When others fail to hear, God hears. Amen.